It was the autumn of 1881, Wyoming Territory, the kind of season when the air smelled of pine and gunpowder, and a man could feel the weight of every mile he carried behind him. Jonathan Cole had seen death before, on battlefields, along cattle trails, in lonely border towns where the law was just a whisper. But nothing prepared him for the moment he knelt beside his brother Calb, dust clinging to blood and breath already fading from the world. There were no last words, no time to bargain with fate. Just silence, broken by the sound of wind slipping through the pines. Jonathan placed Calb's hat gently over his face, and for a long moment the world seemed to tilt. That was his brother, the last piece of family he had left. Have you ever stood at a grave and felt that cold question rise in your chest? What now? Who do I become when the only anchor I had is gone? As Jonathan reached into Calb's coat, searching for matches, his hand brushed against paper worn soft at the edges. 2 letters. Letters from a woman named Georgia. Her words were simple, desperate in their honesty. She was waiting at a homestead in Colorado. 2 boys asking every day about a father who hadn't come home. She wrote not for riches, not for promises, just for someone to stand beside her. Imagine that. While Jonathan stared at his brother's still body, another life flickered out there in the distance. 2 children, a woman keeping her farm together with calloused hands and hope that was wearing thin. It wasn't Jonathan she'd written to. It wasn't him she was waiting for. And yet, reading those words, he felt something heavy shift inside. I think we've all had a moment like that, when someone else's burden suddenly feels like your own. Maybe it was a friend who asked for help moving. Maybe it was family calling in the middle of the night. You know you didn't choose it, but deep down you also know you can't walk away. Jonathan didn't bury those letters with his brother. He folded them, tucked them close, and made a choice. He would head south, across the plains and through the dust, toward a family he had never met. Not out of duty alone, but because some promises once uncovered demand to be carried. So 3 days later, with the wind at his back and grief sitting heavy in the saddle, Jonathan Cole turned his horse toward Colorado, toward Rivermouth, toward Georgia, toward 2 boys waiting for a father who would never return, yet still deserves someone to stand where he meant to. And that, right there, was the beginning of a journey. A story born in blood and silence, but already leaning towards something else, toward the kind of hope that only rises after the darkest kind of loss. By the time Jonathan Cole reached the Colorado plains, 3 days of dust and silence clung to him like a second skin. Rivermouth was barely more than a scatter of buildings, a store, a church with a crooked steeple, and a handful of houses leaning against the wind. But for Jonathan, it wasn't just another frontier town. It was the place where a promise, pulled from his dead brother's coat pocket, was about to change the course of his life. He asked after her, this woman named Georgia Ryland. Folks pointed him toward a farmhouse beyond the orchard, a place held together with patchwork fences and stubborn grit. And when Georgia stepped out onto the porch, apron still dusted with flour, rifle propped within reach, he saw immediately she was not the type to bend easy. Her eyes, sharp and steady, said she'd carried more weight than most men ever would. Jonathan took off his hat, voice low. He told her the truth. Caleb was gone. The words cut through the air like a blade. She didn't weep, not in front of him. She only stiffened, as though bracing herself against a storm she'd always known was coming. And then came the letters. He placed them in her hands. The same pages she had once folded with hope, now returned to her with finality. I wonder, have you ever had to deliver news that felt too heavy for words? That moment when you see the world shift in someone's eyes and you realize nothing will ever be the same again. Then, from behind the house, 2 boys came running, barefoot, full of questions, faces carrying the unmistakable trace of Calb. "Is it Uncle Calb?" one of them asked, his grin bright with innocence. Georgia pulled them close, her voice breaking just enough,
as she said no. This was Jonathan, their uncle. And in that instant, Jonathan understood the weight of the choice he'd made. These boys weren't shadows in a letter anymore. They were flesh, bone, laughter, and need. Georgia offered him Calb's old room for the night. One night turned into mornings fixing fences, afternoons breaking horses, and evenings showing Zachary how to handle a rope without tangling himself. Slowly, the house began to breathe differently. Where silence had settled, there was now the sound of hammers, of lessons being learned, of children laughing again. And Georgia, she watched, at first from the porch, guarded, measuring him, but with each day something shifted. Her gaze softened, not because she needed saving, but because for the first time in a long while, someone chose to stay. Jonathan hadn't planned for this, yet under that roof, with those boys at his side and George's steady presence just across the table, he began to feel something he hadn't felt since before the war, before the loss. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the broken pieces of his life could fit together again.
The days in Rivermouth began to take on a rhythm, the kind of rhythm you only find when life slows down to the pace of the land. Jonathan would rise before the sun, the smell of dew and hay heavy in the air, and by the time Georgia and the boys came out, he was already halfway through mending a fence or clearing a trough. He didn't announce himself as their savior, he just worked, steady as the ticking of a clock. And slowly, the farm and the family began to lean on him. With the boys, it was simple. Kids know whether a man is worth trusting long before words can prove it. Zeke, the older one, took to Jonathan's side like a shadow, asking questions about cattle, about horses, even about the war. Zachary, still clumsy with a hammer, grinned wide every time Jonathan showed him how to hit the nails square. They didn't call him Pa, they didn't need to. You could see it in the way their eyes searched for him at the end of the day, that need for someone who stayed. Georgia was different. She had known men who promised much and left little behind but silence. So when Jonathan fixed a broken shutter or patched the roof, she would watch. Not just the work, but the man. Did he look restless? Was he the kind to drift on when the next town called his name? I think we've all been there in our own way, hesitant to believe in someone new, waiting for them to prove that this time will be different. Trust, after all, is built on the smallest, quietest acts, not grand declarations. Jonathan didn't speak of forever. He didn't need to. Day by day, his actions spoke louder. He taught the boys to plant rows straight, to ride steady, to treat a horse with respect. He sat at George's table each evening, not as a guest passing through, but as if he belonged. And Georgia, though she tried to hold herself back, found her guard softening. She caught herself listening for his footsteps, noticed the way his presence steadied the air inside that farmhouse. One night, when the sky was stretched wide with stars and the cicadas hummed low, Georgia asked him outright, "Why are you still here, Jonathan?" He didn't flinch. He said simply, "Because I don't plan on leaving." And that was it. Not a vow wrapped in poetry, but the kind of truth a heart can rest on. That was the moment something shifted. The grief that bound them both began to make room for something new, not just affection, but a bond carved from responsibility and choice. Love, yes, but also a partnership. And in the quiet of that frontier night, with the land stretching endless around them, Jonathan and Georgia began a new chapter, one rooted not in promises broken, but in promises kept. By the time winter loosened its grip on Rivermouth, Jonathan Cole had become more than just a helping hand. He had slipped into the rhythm of that farm, into the lives of Georgia and her two boys in a way that felt almost inevitable. With Zachary, the younger one, it was easy. His laughter came quick, his trust quicker. But with Zeke, the older boy, it was different. Zeke carried something heavy, the kind of weight no child should bear. The quiet ache of knowing his father was gone, mixed with the stubborn hope that maybe it wasn't true. Jonathan saw it in the way Zeke looked at him, half longing,
half defiance. Instead of pushing, Jonathan gave him space. He taught him how to ride steady, how to mend harness leather, how to carry himself with the dignity of a man, even while still a boy. Slowly, the distance between them shrank. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Zeke sat close by the fire and asked Jonathan if he thought his father would have been proud. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He just placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Yes, and he'd be proud of you for carrying on." That was enough. Sometimes words don't have to be many. They just have to be true. Georgia, too, began to open parts of herself she had kept locked away. One night, with the wind rattling the windows and the lanterns burning low, she told Jonathan about the child she had lost before Zeke and Zachary, a baby girl who lived only days. Her voice broke as she admitted she had never spoken it aloud to anyone, not even to Caleb. Jonathan didn't offer easy comfort. He just listened, and in his silence, she found a kind of shelter. I think we all know what that feels like, the rare relief of having someone sit with your pain without trying to fix it. And then came spring. The cottonwoods bloomed white against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Under one of those trees, Jonathan and Georgia stood together, with the boys at their side, and promised a new life to each other. No preacher, no grand ceremony, just the wind through the branches, 2 rings, and the sound of boys laughing as witnesses. For Georgia, it wasn't about filling an absence anymore. It wasn't about waiting for a man who never returned. It was about choosing. Choosing Jonathan, choosing love, choosing to believe in a future that belonged to her as much to him. And for Jonathan, it was the first time in years that the world didn't feel like a battlefield or a burden. It felt like home.
Life on the farm settled into a steady hum, the kind of rhythm that seeps into your bones until you can't tell where the land ends and you begin. Each morning, Jonathan and Georgia rose before the rooster's crow, their hands already calloused from planting rows of corn, tending to the garden, and driving stakes into the stubborn earth. The boys chased each other between the furrows, their laughter carrying across the fields like music. It was hard work, yes, but it was the kind of work that gave shape to a life. For Jonathan, those days were more than just survival. After years of drifting from one place to another, never staying long enough to leave roots, he found himself waking with purpose. Fixing a fence became more than a chore when Zeke was beside him, learning to 9 knots tight. Feeding the chickens felt different when Zachary tugged at his sleeve, asking 100 questions about why the world worked the way it did. He wasn't just keeping a farm alive, he was raising a family. And maybe that's the truest measure of a man, not the trails he's ridden or the battles he's fought, but the children who look to him with trust in their eyes. Still, the land had its hardships. One evening, Zachary came down with a fever. Georgia stayed at his bedside, wiping his brow, while Jonathan saddled his horse and rode through the night to fetch medicine from town. The trail was dark and cold, but he never once thought of turning back. I can't help but wonder, have you ever realized just how far you'd go for the people you love? Sometimes it's not in grand gestures, but in the quiet certainty of doing what needs to be done, no matter the hour. When he returned at dawn, breathless and bone-tired, Zachary was already sleeping easier. Georgia looked at Jonathan then, not as a widow trying to hold her world together, but as a partner who no longer had to face the weight alone. One night, as they sat by the fire, embers glowing low, Georgia let her thoughts wander aloud. She spoke softly of the idea of more children, of filling the farmhouse with voices and footsteps. Jonathan didn't answer with words right away. He just reached for her hand, rough palm against her own, and held it steady. The thought of more little feet running across those wooden floors didn't frighten him. It felt like hope. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet strength of the land and the fragile beauty of new beginnings, they both understood what they were building wasn't just a farm or even just a family. It was a home, whole, enduring, and deeply theirs.
By the summer of the following year, there was a new kind of warmth in the Ryland home, and it wasn't just from the sun beating down on the fields. Georgia was with child again, her steps a little slower, her smile softer. For Jonathan, the news felt like a gift he never thought he'd receive, a chance not only to love the boys as his own, but to welcome a new life into the world, one that would bind them all even closer. I sometimes think about how children have this quiet way of turning a house into a home. Have you ever noticed that? How just the thought of a baby's cry or a child's laughter changes the way walls hold sound. Jonathan didn't take that gift lightly. He worked harder than ever, not just on the farm, but in town too, mending wagons, fixing saddles, even helping neighbors with their harvest. Folks began to know him as a man they could count on, and in those days, reputation was worth more than gold. And every time he walked back through the farmhouse door, dust on his boots and the smell of sweat and leather clinging to him, he found the boys waiting at the table, eager to tell him about their day. It was Zeke, the elder, who surprised them most. One evening, instead of running off to the barn, he sat quietly at the table, scratching words onto a scrap of paper. When Georgia leaned over, she found he'd written a story, a simple one, about the farm, about his mother, about Jonathan riding out into the hills. It wasn't polished, but it carried a rhythm, a voice. And Jonathan, who had never put much stock in books or letters, found himself staring at the boy with pride that swelled larger than the land around them. Maybe Zeke wasn't meant for a lifetime of tending cattle. Maybe his gift lay in capturing the life around him so others could feel it too. Georgia, in her gentle way, encouraged him, and she began to think of her own family back east, her sister, who had only known her as a young bride full of longing and uncertainty. Georgia wanted her to see what her life had become now, not a tale of waiting and sorrow, but of choosing and flourishing. She spoke of sending for her, to let her witness with her own eyes the laughter of the boys, the steady presence of Jonathan, the promise of a child on the way. Those days were not grand or dramatic, but they were full, the kind of fullness you only recognize when you pause long enough to notice it. And in Rivermouth, under the endless sky, a family once marked by loss now carried the glow of a happiness that was meant to last.
Spring came again to Rivermouth, softer this time, carrying with it not just the promise of new crops, but the cry of new life. Georgia gave birth to a baby girl, small and fierce in her first breaths, her fists curled tight as though she was already ready to take on the world. For Jonathan, holding that child was like touching a future he never thought would belong to him. He'd buried too many dreams in shallow graves along the trail, but this one was alive in his arms, warm and fragile, and wholly theirs. The farmhouse changed with her arrival. The boys, once restless and loud, seemed to grow gentler in her presence, competing over who got to rock her or fetch her blanket. Their laughter filled the rafters, and even the tired groans of hard labor felt lighter against the sound of a baby's giggle. I sometimes think there's nothing that reshapes a home more completely than the laughter of children. It doesn't just echo in the rooms, it carves itself into the walls, into the heart of everyone inside. Jonathan worked the land with a steadier hand than ever, but when evening came, he always found his way back to the porch, where Georgia rocked the baby beneath the wide sky. And there was a peace in those moments, an unspoken truth that after all the roads, all the battles, he had finally arrived where he was meant to be. One night, when the cottonwoods whispered in the wind, Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring. Not gold, not polished, just a band hammered by a blacksmith in town. He slipped it onto George's finger and said, "It's late in coming, but it's yours.
always. And in that small gesture, he sealed what they had already built together, not just a marriage, but a covenant of love that no storm could undo. I wonder, have you ever realized how the truest commitments rarely come dressed in grandeur? They're quiet, steady, like a hand reaching for yours in the dark. That's what Jonathan gave Georgia. Not promises of riches, not dreams of escape, but the certainty of staying. The story doesn't end with fireworks or tragedy. It ends with a family gathered under one roof, their lives stitched together by choice and by love. A widow who learned to trust again. Two boys who found a father where they least expected. A man who traded wandering for belonging. And a newborn child who carried their hope into tomorrow. And in that, perhaps lies the deepest truth of the frontier, that beyond the dust and danger, the greatest victory a man could claim was not land or gold, but a home built strong enough to last. The tale of Georgia and Jonathan is, at its heart, a story about how grief can carve out a hollow in a person's life, only to have love return and fill it in ways they never imagined. When Cowboy died, the land itself seemed to grow quieter, like the prairie had lost one of its strongest voices. Georgia was left with her boys, the farm, and a silence that stretched too wide for one woman to carry alone. I think we've all known that kind of silence at some point, the kind that presses down on you, reminding you of what's gone. Jonathan didn't come riding in like a savior from the dime novels. He wasn't there to erase the memory of his brother or to pretend the pain never happened. Instead, he stayed. He fixed the roof when it leaked. He taught the boys how to mend a fence, how to shoulder a burden without bitterness. Slowly, he became the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself loudly, but makes a home steadier just by being there. And Georgia, after testing him, doubting him, holding her heart back for fear of losing again, found herself choosing him. That's what made all the difference. Their bond wasn't built on desperation or need alone, but on a decision, day after day, to trust, to love, to build something lasting. By the time their family stood beneath the cottonwood to speak their vows, it was clear that this wasn't just about filling the place Cowboy had left behind. Jonathan didn't replace his brother. He honored him by stepping forward with courage, by giving Georgia and the boys a future stitched together, not just by bloodline alone, but by loyalty and devotion. And that's the heart of this story, isn't it? That family isn't always defined by who you're born to, but by who stays when the storms roll in. It's about the ones who choose you, not once, but every single day. I've seen it in my own life, too. The people who mattered most weren't always bound to me by name or history, but by love, by the steady commitment to walk beside me even when the road grew rough. Georgia and Jonathan's journey reminds us that even after loss, even after the world feels emptied out, hope has a way of finding its way back in. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a hand reaching across a dinner table, a man rocking a child that isn't his by birth, or a simple ring slipped on a finger under the wide western sky. That's the promise of their story, isn't it? That from sorrow can rise a home, whole and enduring, built not just on survival, but on love freely chosen.